Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today we're going to be covering the long-awaited and long-anticipated Helsinki Longsword Open 2025 Longsword Finals. And this was a gold medal match between Máté and Maarten, and no, I'm not going to make an attempt at their last names. However, normally this is the part where I would tell you who is sitting primarily on the right and who's on the left, but the good people at EHMS were doing their absolute best with their camera work in order to try to keep the fencers in frame and keep the action at a good angle, and as a result, they often switch them between the left and right side. So instead of doing it that way, I'm simply going to tell you that Máté is the one with the black and white striped plunderhosen, and Maarten is the one with the blue socks, and you're just going to have to figure out which side they're on pretty much on every individual exchange. So, starting off with our first exchange, we don't see what would normally be considered a feeling out period. Both of these fencers go in and start immediately trying to do their pre-prescribed motions. Máté appears to be going for hand shots and counter stabs to the chest, and Maarten appears to be trying to probe his way into the mid-range and going for a lot of leg shots. At the very least, that's what he looks like he's intending to do. And for the most part, this strategy looks pretty sound from both fencers. Máté is clearly a very tall person, and as a result has a bit of an advantage in that they have longer arms and can probably better seek the most exposed target of their opponent with long shots while still staying outside of range. Maarten, of course, being the slightly shorter fencer, has to be the one to close into the gap and be the one who has the better in-the-pocket fencing, and going for the leg shots in this instance isn't necessarily a bad idea, as it's often a very difficult to parry target, and one, if you do it right, where you can hit and get out without necessarily getting hand sniped. At the exact same time, this is a 3.2 point system, meaning that you get 3 points for deep targets, 2 points for shallow, and that puts a little bit of emphasis on shallow targets, because while obviously hitting a deep target is going to get you 3 points, hitting a shallow target getting you 2 means that you're not at so much of a disadvantage if you only go for them in perpetuity. Now, towards the end of the exchange, Máté goes for one of his hand shots. It gets parried, shoved off to the side, at which point Maarten strikes him in the leg and manages to get out of distance, just like we mentioned earlier, and gets a clean 2 points. And it really shows right off the bat what kinds of adaptations we're going to be seeing from now on. For our second exchange, we see another iteration of the previous strategies that we saw in the first exchange. Máté is still trying to throw his sword out there in order to trigger a response or get a hand snipe, and Maarten is still trying to close that distance. However, Máté has started doing something very smart, which is he's throwing out probing thrusts. Now, one of the things about thrusts is that they're very, very easy to overextend, primarily because you have to usually get your tip at least a couple inches past your target in order for it to be a valid thrust. As a result, a lot of people overextend their feet and overextend their hands when going for a thrust. But Máté is not doing that here. What he is doing is very clearly throwing his thrust forward, directing it more or less towards the hands, and forcing Maarten to throw a parry. But he is not overextending with his distance or his feet, and as a result, he is looking to try to trigger Maarten into going forward with heavy footwork, on the assumption that if he parries a thrust, he will have an opening. So he's throwing out these probing thrusts. He's not giving Maarten the opening that he thinks he has. As a result, Maarten comes forward, throws a big cut of his own, which Máté parries, and then they both pull off and they both go for a final strike. Maarten goes for the leg, however, he goes for the leg while moving forward, and as a result has no defense in his upper openings and takes a strike to the head. Now, in my opinion, based on the previous little bit, there's not a lot to talk about as far as tempo. The idea that any one of them threw a parry or a beat attack in the previous tempo just is hard to determine. And while the judges give Máté the 3 points clean for this, I would definitely see the idea that that leg shot was good enough and in tempo enough to be considered a double. So for our next exchange, we have another situation where Máté is going for these hand shots, and this is the first time we get a real steady camera angle and a really good indication of how he's setting up these hand shots and how he's trying to deliver them. So from the stance that Máté is in, he has a very, very tight elbowed long point or plow. And the idea here is that this is ensuring that his hands are always behind his crossguard, and he's doing all of his motions from this starting position. So when he goes for these hand shots, generally what he does is he waves his sword off to the back side to kind of give it a little bit of wind up, and then come in the back or on the side. And the reason this is so effective is because this first starting action is such a massive feint and so difficult to tell exactly what attack may or may not be coming. He's essentially going from a plow to a kind of Vomtog starting position, and from there he is throwing these hand shots, sweeping around and to the side. And I think one of the reasons that these are landing so well is because Maarten is holding his sword with his left hand all the way down on the pommel. This is actually creating a very nice opening for Máté to seek because his hands are so far apart. He essentially has another 5 or 6 inches of distance that he can go inwards with his cutting strikes and still be able to hit a hand where normally a pommel or a crossguard would be getting in the way. As a result, when Maarten continually tries to come forward, he is constantly seeing Máté going backwards and throwing these hand strikes, only to find that every time Maarten comes forward and he presents some kind of guard as he moves forward, his hands are open where he clearly doesn't think they normally would be. So at this point in the fight, Máté has a pretty commanding lead, and Maarten is going to have some pretty and smart adaptations if he wants to start bringing this fight back. And he really goes back to the first set of options that he saw working in some of the early exchanges, which are these leg shots. Now, one thing I say all the time is that it's very risky to throw a leg shot while moving forward because it leaves you very open and it requires you to enter into range, hit the leg, and then oftentimes stay in range for that follow-up attack. But one of the ways in which this can be useful is if you know for a fact your opponent is going to back up. And that is more or less what Maarten knew when he was going into this. He threw a big, dramatic, overly showy strike while moving forward, ensuring that Máté was going to try to match his footwork and go backwards, at which point he changed levels, went for that leg shot and got it, only to find that when Máté tried to throw his counter shot, he was already out of range because he had done too dramatic or too large a footwork in order to try to maintain range with Maarten. As a result, Maarten got a clean strike to the leg and got out clean. However, there's something else I want to point out here, which is this entire time I've been talking about Máté's probing thrusts, and I haven't really had a chance to talk about them yet because he hasn't landed any. But this is another interesting iteration where as soon as that strike hits Máté in the leg, he goes for a very quick and very precise thrust that just barely isn't quite in range. And I think it's really worth pointing out how Máté is throwing these thrusts and also where he's aiming them. It appears that he is aiming them not for the center of the shoulder line like most people would, but for the forward hip. Now, there's an interesting idea here, which is that every time you go for a thrust, most of the time you want to throw them up high, because this is what's going to give you the best chance of binding with somebody else's high line attack and keeping you safe while simultaneously seeking your target. But going low can be very problematic because what happens is as you hit somebody in the hip, their high line attack is just going to be able to go up right over your guard and hit you in the head. However, Máté is much taller than his opponent, as we pointed out earlier, and Maarten is constantly going for low line attacks of his own. So as a result, by going for this lead hip, he's actually increasing his chances that he's going to not only land that stab, if he does, but he's going to be able to zone out his hands from any kind of counter action. And that actually is a really intelligent adaptation to the kind of game that they've been having up till now. If it ever comes to pass that Máté is starting to land these thrusts, he's probably going to be able to zone out any of the low line attacks that Maarten keeps throwing and keep himself safe while still landing a very deep target. So this next exchange is pretty messy and does inevitably get thrown out by the judges, but it is important to still showcase it because it shows what kinds of strategies both fencers are still going for. Maarten is still trying to close the range, get into that middle area and throw low line attacks in order to hit and then get out before getting hit back. And Máté is still trying to go with those sniping thrusts towards the lead hip of his opponent and trying to throw hand shots as they're coming forward anytime they come forward with their hands upwards in a kind of crawl position. While we don't see either of those things work out, it still shows that these two fighters are still trying to look for new adaptations to get around their opponent's moves, but they still haven't found something that works yet. Next up, we have a really smart adaptation from Maarten. Now, one thing I've been saying this whole time is that he's been trying to get into that mid-range, and that is still true here, but this time he switches it up, and instead of going for low-line targets like the leg, he goes way up high. And in my opinion, this was the adaptation he probably should have been trying to do this entire time. However, we can also see how difficult it is for Maarten to get into that mid-range, while Máté is constantly throwing the threat of these single-time thrusts towards that low line, and most importantly, those hand shots that punish Maarten every single time he comes into range with any kind of preparatory motion. However, this time it does end up working out because Maarten, as he comes forward, he manages to parry not one but two hand shots, at which point he finally gets Máté backed up all the way against the ring. And when he sees Máté start to come forward ever so slightly with an attack of his own, he times it just so that when he misses, to come in with a shield how of his own way up on the top, that when Máté tries to parry, he is unable to do so. Now Máté, for his credit, when he does throw up this parry, tries to parry it, doesn't really quite get it, but then comes back around with a very nice middle how follow-up to the body, which shows that he still knows what he was going to do if he had landed that parry. But of course, it was not quite fast enough, and this gives Maarten a very crucial 3 points, which brings him back into striking range of this match. Of course, right as Maarten finally finds his pace, he gets his hopes dashed a little bit by getting struck in the hands once again. And once again, the reason he gets struck in the hands is because Máté is finding a home for his blade in what is essentially a scooping motion type hand strike. As I said before, he is doing all of his preparations by pulling his sword back and then coming around to the side with a kind of middle how to the hands. But one thing he's doing that's very key is that he's doing almost a Fiore style brushstroke underneath that's giving it that little bit of that unterhow bottom to top motion that's key for striking people's hands when they throw up a wall parry. What I mean by a wall parry is, as you can see, what Maarten is doing here is he's holding his hands off to the side like this and hoping that the strike is coming downward at an angle so that his crossguard will get in the way. But because this is coming upwards at an angle, it is allowing that strike to hit the bottom part of his left hand, and it is creating an opening that he is not necessarily aware is there, and he has to completely change up a parry in order to stay safe. Either that, or he has to start voiding out of the way, which we already know he doesn't want to do because he's still trying to get into that middle range where he's close enough to throw his techniques and not get outranged by a much taller fencer. So for our next exchange, we have another bit of a messy one, but another one that showcases the strategies of both of these fencers and how Máté's strategy has just been dominating this fight the entire time, given that he is able to completely control the distance. Now, as I've said before, Maarten has been trying to get into that middle range, and Máté has been consistently denying him with short little thrusts toward the body, which he has to parry, and short little cuts to the hand, which he has to parry completely differently. And as a result, we have another clear exchange where every single time Maarten takes a step forward, Máté throws some kind of probing strike that Maarten has to take seriously and backs up. And it is so difficult to get past the defensives of someone who is able to do that so effectively like Máté here. Every single time you take a step forward and you want to throw something to a deep target, you end up exposing your hands and you get hit in the hands. But every time you start charging forward, you're watching out for those thrusts, because if you charge aimlessly, you're going to end up running straight into a point. It almost seems hopeless in this case that Maarten will ever be able to get a deep target. However, I want to go back and think about the exchange that Maarten had a couple ago, where he was able to parry a couple of those hand strikes and throw a follow-up cut of his own. Máté's backwards motion is his biggest weakness, and if you can properly time every single time Máté goes backwards, you should be able to get hits of your own as long as you are willing to overcommit that little bit and then be able to get out knowing that he is going too far backwards. Unfortunately, though, Maarten seems to only know how to try to charge people down by going for deep targets in this middle line, and as a result, he is going to consistently get sniped in the hands for the rest of this fight. So this is the last exchange, and unfortunately it's kind of ruined by the fact that the camera angle changes about 4 times in the middle of the exchange. But as you can kind of see what happens in the slow motion, Maarten comes in for a Hail Mary shot to the body, and Máté simply hits him in the hands, and this results in an open double where Maarten gets 3 points and Máté gets 2, and that is enough to get Máté over the point cap. It's not a particularly exciting exchange to end on, but it again shows just how difficult it can be to get past someone with a solid defense that comes in the form of attacks in preparation toward your hands. Now, obviously, one thing that I haven't mentioned up till now is that this was, of course, the finals of Helsinki Longsword Open, but you probably didn't recognize any of the people who were fencing. I know I sure didn't. And the reason for that is a lot of the people who you normally would recognize as being in the finals here were eliminated early on. And there are some people who are going to maybe be a little bit upset about that because they didn't see their favorite fencers at the highest level. But one thing you have to appreciate is that there is no real level of fencing you can ever get to where getting sniped in the hands or constantly dealing with someone who's walking backwards and hand sniping you is ever going to become easy. No matter what, we have to make sure that when we're talking about the fencing ability of other people, we don't look at certain applications of certain processes as cheap or easy. There is nothing easy about what Máté is doing here. There is nothing easy about what Maarten is having to try to overcome. Every single time that they are successful, it would be disrespectful of the concept of fencing overall to simply look at this and say, oh, well, they're not doing the fanciest stuff that I like to do or I think is the best demonstration of techniques. Therefore, it's bad fencing. This was not bad fencing. This was very clean fencing. And in a lot of ways, when you're at this high level, hand sniping is one of the cleanest ways to get out of an exchange without getting hit back. So to anybody who would complain about this final exchange, do a little bit of self-reflection and not only ask yourself, what would I do to try to get around Máté's hand snipes and could I have done a better job than Maarten? But more importantly, what does that say about the skill level of the people on display here? There might be an instinct that you have to say, oh, well, these were simple techniques. These must be easy, simple fencers. And that is completely wrong. These are very high-level fencers who are doing a lot of very high-level things. And despite the fact that it didn't get into that 4D chess level area, doesn't mean that it was any less of a good fight and a good representation of the gold medal match of Helsinki Longsword Open. So I'm obviously going to be talking about this one for a while because there was a lot of good fights, and I'm going to be talking about how the Americans did since there were a lot of Americans that went to Helsinki this year. And if you're looking forward to that conversation, it will be coming out on Thursday.